It's time for Recipe of the Day. I have a barbecue pulled pork loin recipe on Cook the Story that people are crazy about, including me. And so I wanted to do the same basic idea, but not for pulled and barbecue. Like, what if you want to have a pork loin in the slow cooker, but not have it be pulled pork barbecue? You know what I mean? So today's recipe is for a slow cooker pork loin that you would serve more like sliced like a roast. But the thing that's so great about it is that the sauce is done right in there with it. And so you end up kind of like with this tangy, delicious gravy sauce and your pork all done in the slow cooker. It's really easy and tasty. Really good comfort food too, you know? I will say, and I say this all the time, pork loin is not my favorite of the porks. I really find it to be a little bit drier. It's lean, right? It's almost like the equivalent of chicken breast compared to chicken thigh. So your pork loin is like leaner, drier, like chicken white meat, whereas your like pork butt and ribs and other cuts of pork are more like chicken thighs, that juicier, darker meat, you know? So this is the leaner white pork meat. And so it is going to be a little bit less juicy than some other cuts of pork, but that's why we're cooking it in a sauce, and you'll have that sauce to smother all over it. That really, really helps it out. The other thing that helps is if you are willing to cook it to an internal temperature, a final internal temperature of 145 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the lowest safe temperature for pork loin, and it is just a tiny bit pink in the middle at that temperature. Totally safe, but just a little bit pink right in the middle, and that actually means that it's going to be juicier. Just like people who like their steaks medium rare, they have that redness through the middle, they're more tender, more juicy. Same thing here. I will say though that I know a lot of people have grown up always having their pork more well cooked. The guideline when I was growing up was 160 degrees Fahrenheit, which is fully white and quite a bit drier. So if you grew up like that, then the little bit of pink in the middle of the pork might not be appealing to you. So what you might want to do is just start trying to work down to slightly lower temperatures, right? So if you're used to a finished temperature of 160, maybe you try 155. Get used to 155, maybe you try 150. Find out where your sweet spot is, and it's going to be juicier, I promise. Now, a brine will also help with this juiciness here, but I don't typically like to brine things that I'm slow cooking, especially since we have this sauce going on. Some of the salt from the brine can come out into the sauce, and I just don't think it is the best idea. When I'm dry roasting pork loin, like in just a regular oven in a roasting pan, then brining it is brilliant and makes a huge difference and works really well. But I don't think I recommend that exactly for the slow cooker. Okay, one final thing before I jump into the recipe. The recipe calls for a 5-pound pork loin. If yours is between 4 to 7 pounds, nothing about the recipe has to change. The timing might be slightly different, but not a huge difference. And the amount of seasoning is going to be just fine. If your pork loin roast is under 4 pounds, you're going to want to halve the amount of seasoning, so half as much, and the amount of sauce. And then as to cooking time, you're going to start checking it a little bit earlier to make sure that you don't overcook it. So it's going to be at the 4-hour mark if you're cooking it on low, and the 2-hour mark if you're cooking it on high. That's when you start checking. Okay, let's jump into this recipe. You are getting a large onion and slicing it and putting it into the bottom of your slow cooker. Then you're getting out your 5-pound pork loin roast, and you are seasoning that all over with a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of garlic powder, a teaspoon of smoked paprika, and half a teaspoon of black pepper. I find it easier to mix those things together first. So get out a little bowl, mix together a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of garlic powder, a teaspoon of smoked paprika, half a teaspoon of black pepper, stir that up, and then season from there onto the roast. And then you can kind of be patting it as you season it. Season, pat, move it around, and not worry that your now dirty hands that have touched the pork are touching all the seasoning containers and everything. They're just going into that bowl, and then you're going to use all of the seasoning from that bowl, and then you're going to put that bowl in your dishwasher. So that is perfectly safe and good. Then, if your pork roast has a fattier side, often these pork loin roasts do have a thin layer of fat on them. I do not take any of that off of there because, as I was saying, these pork loin roasts are very lean, and every little bit of fat and juice we can keep in them, the better. Some people do trim it off though. I will leave that up to you. I leave it on there, and I put it fat side up in the slow cooker so that any fat that melts is going to drip down through the meat. When I do this in the oven, the reason for doing it fat side up is because it's going to crisp up really well, right? We're not going to get any crisping in the slow cooker, but we do want that nice juicy fat to melt down into the meat. So you've seasoned up your pork roast and you're putting it on top of the onions in the slow cooker. Then in a medium-sized bowl, we're going to whisk up the sauce. It's 3/4 of a cup of honey, a half a cup of melted butter. So really the easiest thing to do is to do the butter first. So melt the butter in a bowl in the microwave and then add the honey to that. 3/4 of a cup of honey, half a cup of melted butter, and then to that add 2 tablespoons of ketchup and a tablespoon of cider vinegar and half a teaspoon of salt. Mix that up and pour it over top of the roast in the slow cooker. Put the lid on the slow cooker and then you're cooking it until the internal temperature is 5 degrees lower than your goal. So if you are going for 145 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to stop cooking it when it's at 140. If you're going for 160 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to stop cooking it when it's at 155. So for the 140, that is going to be approximately 5 hours on low or 3 hours on high. If you're home and you can, I recommend that you start checking the internal temperature a good hour before those times because these pork loin roasts are a little tricky. They are different thicknesses. If you've seen them before, you know what I mean. Some of them are quite a bit narrower, like their diameter is much, much smaller than others. They're just going to cook in different amounts of time. There's not much that we can do about that. Well, there's not much that we can do about it except being aware of it, paying attention to how thick, how big our roasts are, and then starting to check the temperature accordingly. If your slow cooker has any kind of thermometer probe that lets you put the thermometer into the roast as it's cooking so that you can monitor the temperature on the outside, that is great. The digital probe thermometer that I use when I'm roasting things in the oven works with my slow cooker as well. So I can put the probe into the meat and then the little wire comes out and my lid still fits just fine. And then I can read the digital reading on mine as well. So I don't have to start checking by like opening it up and looking. I can just use that. I will link to the digital probe thermometer that I have in the show notes for this podcast episode because it's under $20 and it works just fine. It's not fancy in any way, shape, or form, but it just works. So I will link to that for you in case you want to get one. Okay, so once your pork is at that temperature, which was 5 degrees below our desired finish temperature, you take the pork out of the slow cooker and put it on a plate with some foil tented over it to stay warm. And then in a small bowl, mix together a 1/4 cup of water and 2 tablespoons of cornstarch. And you swirl that into the sauce in the slow cooker, sort of stirring the whole time. Stir that in, put the lid back on, set the slow cooker to high and cook it covered in there for about 15 minutes, just until it's thickened. If it's thickened, it's done. So if it's thickened before 15 minutes, that's perfectly fine. I just know that 15 minutes is definitely enough. At that point, you can double check the internal temperature of your pork roast, make sure that it got above 145 degrees Fahrenheit minimally, then slice it thinly. That is another thing that helps. When you have leaner, drier meats, when they are thinner, that helps us because we don't have to cut through so much of them with our teeth, and that makes it seem like they are more tender than they might be. So slice your pork loin roast thinly and then top it with the sauce and those onions that are down in that sauce. They're really nice. So put those on there as well. And you're ready to try your slow cooker pork loin roast with that buttery, honey, tangy sauce and the onions. Really, really tasty. I know you're going to love this one. I will put the link to this recipe in the show notes for this podcast episode, or you can head to cookthestory.com/ROTD and get it there, or find it in our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/recipeOTD. And hey, just a quick note. I'm on a recording hiatus right now, so for the next little while, I'm replaying episodes from the archives, including this one. If you heard me mention a holiday, a season, or something going on in my life that seemed a bit off, that's why. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you're enjoying these older episodes. I am Christine Pittman from cookthestory.com, thecookful.com, cookfor2.us, and from this podcast, Recipe of the Day. I hope you have a great day. Let's get cooking.